I cannot say enough good things about the Daniel Negreanu class on poker and now 10-time world champion Phil Ivey's courses on Texas Hold'em that I've watched and rewatched on Masterclass's platform. Both Ivey and Negreanu's classes have helped me establish sound fundamentals and even some advanced technique in my Texas Hold'em game. Those are only two of scores of courses available on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself professionally or in your hobbies and support the show by using the link in the show notes. Now, to our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
It was after midnight in Johannesburg on December 18th, 1898. Tom Edgar stumbled home. Tom was drunk. So Tom's judgment was impaired. Tom got into a drunken brawl with another Uitlander. Though Tom Edgar was drunk, he did land a knockout punch, dropping his foe unconscious. Fearing that Edgar had killed their friend, some of the unconscious man's friends called the police. Ian Smith continues the story, writing, quote, 4 Afrikaner policemen arrived on the scene and followed Edgar to his house. When he refused to open the door, one of the policemen, called Jones, forced it open and entered the house without a warrant. When Edgar then hit Officer Jones with a stick, Jones shot him dead. Jones was promptly arrested and charged with murder. The public prosecutor then reduced the charge to manslaughter and released Jones on the very modest bail of £200. When the acting British agent Fraser protested about this, Smuts, the state attorney, had Jones rearrested. At the trial in February 1899, Jones was found not guilty by the jury, and the judge, who was only 25, said that he hoped that the police would always know how to do their duty. The Edgar incident was not so extraordinary in a rough town like Johannesburg in the 1890s, but it occurred in the wake of a whole number of cases in which armed Transvaal police, known as ZARPs, had acted in an arrogant and brutal manner towards British subjects, both white and colored, on the Rand, raiding houses at night and making arrests without warrants. A situation of tension and hostility between Uitlanders and the police had built up. The shooting of Edgar, and then the light treatment and acquittal of the policeman who had killed him, brought about the second reform movement on the Rand. Then was immediately made into a political issue by the South African League. End quote.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Alfred Milner had needed an incident like the Edgar shooting for months. Paul Creer's commanding electoral victory sent out shockwaves in February of 1898. When W.P. Schreiner's party took over just weeks later in the Cape Colony and vowed to seek friendship with Boer republics as well, a disturbing trend appeared to many British policymakers. But Alfred Milner did not wait even for that trend to emerge. Milner lost all faith in a policy of patience, a policy of waiting for the Creer administration to implode. After Creer won his 4th term as president of the South African Republic, Milner's actions betray, at least to some historians, that Milner had lost hope. For example, one member wrote that it could be better for Creer to end the Transvaal's independence with his intransigence rather than for Schalk Burger to win the election and make modest reforms. Just days after Creer's victory was announced, Milner asked London permission to work up to crisis and force a dramatic stand-down by Creer or a dramatic showdown with Creer before it was too late. Milner wrote to Chamberlain saying, quote, "There is no way out of the political troubles of South Africa except reform in the Transvaal, or war. And at present the chances of reform in the Transvaal are worse than ever." End quote. What's ironic is that some members of the South African League that sought reform on behalf of Uitlanders saw the potential good in Creer winning his fourth term. But Joseph Chamberlain wanted people to forget about South Africa for a couple years after the Jameson raid, and instructed Milner to make peace with South Africa his greatest object. Milner decided then that he had to change Chamberlain and company's mind and build support among the British public via the press for getting aggressive with South Africa. Though Milner and Chamberlain disagreed over how quickly South Africa had to be forced into British Union, Milner saw implied permission to try to get South African Uitlanders to stir things up enough that the British would have to get involved. Milner began working his network of press, government, and banker contacts, trying to get people used to the idea of a possible need for British intervention. This network included the Prime Minister, the Queen, and the Rothschilds. One of Creer's first acts in his fourth term as president was to dismiss his long-term rival, Chief Justice Kotze. Many of Kotze's judicial peers found Kotze provocative when Kotze wrote to Creer to reclaim the testing right that Kotze claimed he was entitled to since the revised constitution had not been published as promised. Kotze spoke treacherously then by saying that he would appeal his dismissal to, quote, "the suzerain power," the British. Milner was all too eager to demand the British to take advantage of this dismissal to intervene in Transvaal affairs, but Chamberlain and others would not sign off on what they thought would have been a very transparent, ill-advised attempt to instigate something with the Transvaal. Both Milner and Rhodes made statements in March that irritated many Cape Afrikaners because both men attacked the Transvaal and cast doubt on the loyalty of Cape Afrikaners to the British. After Rhodes and Milner's March outbursts, the Cape Colony's Treasurer General John Merryman urged Free State President Martinus Steyn to persuade Creer to reform or risk losing the freedom of all the South African states. Percy Fitzpatrick was arrested after the Jameson raid because he was the honorary secretary of the Reform Committee. Fitzpatrick got a 2-year sentence, was hit with a £2,000 fine, and debarred from political activity for 3 years for his involvement in the Jameson raid. He wrote a defense of the Reform Committee's actions that became one of the most influential reports on the raid and Transvaal politics in 1899. You will hear shortly of how Fitzpatrick and Milner sparked a relationship. But first, was Percy Fitzpatrick an unqualified imperialist? Or was Fitzpatrick someone earnestly seeking equal civil rights for all whites in South Africa? Was Fitzpatrick someone who, according to his rampantly jingoistic biographer, originally did not want the Boers to lose their independence? Some historical debate centers on this question. In a letter to Jan Smuts, about 20 years after the Anglo-Boer War, Fitzpatrick gives what could be important background for why he sought more rights for the Uitlanders in the Transvaal. Fitzpatrick's family had fought for Irish rights for 3 generations before he tried to get Uitlander rights through whatever means necessary. For the story of what rights the Irish fought for before and after 1898, see episode 1.10b, Bonus, Irish Home Rule. Fitzpatrick, writing to Smuts in 1923, said, quote, "And whatever anyone may think of it, no one will deny that I was moved by precisely the same rebellious impulse against unfair treatment. In fact, though we never thought of the phrase, we were for equal rights. I was indebted, strangely enough, to Lord Milner, long afterwards, for the clearing up of this. He asked me one day what on earth had first prompted me to get into this reform movement, as we call it. Was there anything like it in my family history? Of course, he asked it laughingly, but I suddenly remembered that I was the fourth successive eldest son who had gone to jail for the same cause." End quote. Whatever and whoever Percy Fitzpatrick was, he violated his prohibition from politics as soon as he could. He had already been working behind the scenes for reform in Johannesburg since his early release from prison in May 1896. Fitzpatrick took the job of the arrested Lionel Phillips, the former Chamber of Mines president you heard from in episode 1.18. Fitzpatrick took charge of Werner and Byte H. Eckstein and Company's intelligence arm. Fitzpatrick worked for reform, but harbored pessimism informed by his experience working on the 1897 Industrial Commission, the commission whose substantial reforms remained ignored or marginally implemented. That isn't, by the way, to say that no negotiations continued between the Creer government and the mining industry into 1898 and beyond. For example, Smith says, quote, "Discussion took place on the government's proposal to introduce a 5% tax on mining profits, on measures to improve mine labor recruitment, and on the readiness of the mining industry to underwrite a loan of £2.5 million to the Transvaal government in return for the cancellation of the dynamite monopoly." End quote. But anyway, back to Percy Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick biked over to Alfred Milner's residence in the Cape Colony in February of 1898. They talked late into that summer evening's night. Fitzpatrick later said that this meeting impacted not only his own life, but also the future of South Africa. Fitzpatrick would go on to play a major role as a vital linkman between mining magnates, Creer's government, the Uitlanders, and Alfred Milner. In Fitzpatrick and Milner's February 1898 meeting, Milner wanted to know everything. Fitzpatrick told Milner that the British government should wait for a proper opportunity to fix the whole of the Transvaal's problems. Quote, "The native policy, the franchise, redistribution of seats, court of appeal, once and forever." Milner reportedly nodded in agreement, saying he would build a cumulative case to throw down before Creer when the right opportunity arose. Milner reportedly said, quote, "There is only one possible settlement, war. It has got to come. The difficulty is in the occasion and not in the job itself. That is very easily done, and I think nothing of the bogies and difficulties of settling South Africa afterwards." End quote. Fitzpatrick made contact with another very important man you learned about in episode 1.14, Jan Smuts, the Transvaal's new state attorney. Fitzpatrick found Smuts a very fair and intelligent man with a heartbreaking task. Fitzpatrick discussed an epic plan to square the circle. The plan included the cancellation of the dynamite, railway, and liquor concessions to be replaced by a sales tax and compensation payment and a loan to the Transvaal government that the mining industry would underwrite. Fitzpatrick hoped that these economic reforms would clear the way for political reforms with the British government involved. Smuts voiced personal support for ending the dynamite monopoly, but saw little chance of other monopolies being terminated since mining companies had stake in these too. Smuts dashed Fitzpatrick's hopes, saying that the dynamite people were far too strong, and Creer's mind far too influenced by crony capitalists for Fitzpatrick's deal to be considered. As a matter of fact, Creer soon proposed a 15-year extension of the dynamite monopoly to the Volksraad. Fitzpatrick lost hope in Smuts's will and potency. Then Fitzpatrick reordered priorities. Make political reforms first, then economic reforms. Fitzpatrick believed the British High Commissioner of South Africa, Alfred Milner, had to be involved. Then Fitzpatrick had another conversation that rivaled the February 1898 conversation he and Milner had late into the night. When Milner shared his idea to Smuts of the Transvaal, inviting Milner to participate in helping make political reforms, Smuts gave Fitzpatrick a lasting insight into the mind of Creer's government. Smuts immediately rejected the involvement of the British government, whether it be through Milner or any other official in the South African Republic's internal affairs. This is not how an independent nation should be treated. Smith writes of this exchange, reporting, quote, Fitzpatrick thereupon let himself go. Do you realize what it's leading to? He asked. And what must inevitably happen if we don't make a supreme effort to get a settlement? Do you realize that it means war? Smuts calmly replied that he knew what it meant, and when Fitzpatrick incredulously inquired whether he seriously contemplated a war with the British Empire, which would mean the end of the Transvaal's independence within 6 months, Smuts replied, quote, Not in 6 months, not in 6 years. You may take the cities and the mines, for we would not meet you there, but for 6 or 7 years we shall be able to hold out in the mountains. And long before that, there will be a change of opinion in England. Other things will crop up. They will become tired and lose interest. There will be another general election, and the Liberals will come into power. And this time we shall get all that we want. End quote. Fitzpatrick later said this conversation devastated his dreams and proved to him that war was a dismal certainty. This was all fine with Milner. Milner at this point was determined to crush Afrikanerdom and provoke a quarrel with the Transvaal. If you would like to help keep Forgotten Wars producing and growing, would you do at least 2 of 3 things? First, would you share a link to the podcast with someone you think might enjoy it? Second, if you're listening on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or other providers, would you make sure to like or follow our podcast? If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, would you give us a 5-star rating and write a thoughtful review there? You can even do that while you're listening. Lastly, if you want more from the show, bonus episodes, behind the mic access, transcripts and sources, and much more, and you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ForgottenWars. That is patreon.com/ForgottenWars. The link is also in this episode's notes. Thanks to those of you who have done one of these things already. Know that you're appreciated. Now, back to our episode. Jan Smuts, on the other hand, was very concerned by a conversation he had with Edmund Fraser on December 22nd, 1898. Fraser was acting in place of Conyngham Green, acting British agent in Pretoria. Pakenham recounts Smuts's report from his conversation with Fraser. Quote, Fraser began to talk to me in the most unexpected way. He said that the British government had now sat still for 2 years because its own officials had put it in a false position in the Jameson raid. The time had now, however, come for her to take action. I asked him what he meant. He said that Gladstone had made a great mistake in giving the country back after Machuba before having defeated the Boers. The Boers throughout South Africa had a vague aspiration for a great republic throughout South Africa, and Gladstone had, by his action, encouraged this aspiration in them. The British government knew of this, but had always remained sitting still. But in his opinion, the time had now come to make an end of this by striking a blow. In his opinion, the time had come to make an end of all this by showing the Boers that England was master in South Africa. I asked him what would give occasion for this. He said that England was very dissatisfied about the maladministration and especially about the ill treatment of her subjects, which was worse here than elsewhere. He knew well that England would not go fighting about abstract subjects such as suzerainty. She would fight about things that everyone could understand. End quote. Imagine yourself in Smuts, the Transvaal state attorney's shoes, hearing Fraser say all this. The shaken Smuts promptly wrote a report of this whole conversation for the Transvaal government. But lest we think this conversation certainly happened, let me throw a wrinkle in. One Chris Ashe strongly doubts that this conversation with Smuts and Fraser ever happened. Ashe can't see what objective Fraser thought he would meet by revealing British plans to strike a blow. Ashe also finds it very suspicious that Smuts did not immediately make Fraser's remarks public. Couldn't Milner and Chamberlain have been humiliated, even undermined, if these remarks had been made public? Now, there is a lot to say about Chris Ashe, but we are going to get to that in our next episode. The year 1898 also indicated Krieger's lack of trust in German support. On August 30th, 1898, the Anglo-German agreement that had been negotiated in secret was ratified in secret. This Anglo-German agreement remained a secret until after World War I. Germany and the British agreed to partition Portugal's colonies, with the British taking control of Delagoa Bay in the event of a Portuguese default. That Portuguese default never happened, thanks to a French loan. Germany agreed to give up any say over Delagoa Bay and eliminated the possibility of Germany being an ally of the Transvaal. The German government from then on urged the Transvaal to adopt reforms demanded by German and British Uitlanders and businesses. As Alfred Milner tried to lock the British Empire into a collision course with the Transvaal, Milner worked his many contacts in Britain to get the press, including publications like the National Review, on his side. Milner also worked with mining magnates to influence and support newspapers within the Transvaal that would voice a pro-British, pro-Uitlander, anti-Krieger message. In the meantime, President Krieger also worked to buy off papers or coerce Transvaal papers to say what he wanted them to say. It looked like President Krieger would be utterly humiliated when the Volksraad rejected his proposal by a vote of 15-13 to renew the dynamite monopoly for another 15 years. This monopoly renewal only passed on a second attempt that very likely involved bribing a couple swing votes. But then, as you heard at the beginning of the show, Tom Edgar died at the hands of Officer Jones, a ZARP. Without getting required permission from local authorities, the South African League organized a humongous public demonstration when Officer Jones was released on bail. Between 4,000 and 5,000 gathered on Christmas Eve in 1898, singing patriotic British songs, signing a petition to the Queen, and fighting with the police. The petition complained of ZARP violence against British subjects in the Rand, railed against the injustice of the Krieger regime, and complained about having no voice in Transvaal politics. Alfred Milner happened to be in England at the time, so the acting British High Commissioner in his place was Sir William Butler, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of British troops. But Butler thought Uitlanders were troublemakers, and refused to send the Christmas Eve petition on to the Queen. When British Parliament reassembled in early 1899, they had not discussed South Africa for almost a year. But whether many MPs and officials saw it or not, liked it or not, the way to war in South Africa was opening up. The foreign entanglements that weighed on Chamberlain in 1898 were wrapped up. The British and Russia were coming to an understanding about China. The French backed down at Fashoda. General Kitchener conquered Sudan and avenged the death of General Gordon, and the Germans had just stepped away from South African affairs in the Anglo-German agreement. Krieger, on the other hand, was not set on an epic collision with the British. At least that is what most historians on the subject argue. Krieger's government approached the mining industry in February 1899 to suggest a meeting where a general economic settlement could be reached. The Great Deal negotiations began the next month with no British representation, but plenty of informants. The mining industry refused to have its concerns separated from the Uitlander concerns. I'll name just a few key proposed reforms. Krieger tried to maintain monopolies while reducing prices for mines. The Transvaal government also proposed legislation that would grant franchise to Uitlanders after 5 years' residence. 5 years' residence was all that was required in Natal, the Cape Colony, and the Orange Free State. Krieger also made promises, gestures, at further substantive reform. These Great Deal negotiations were complicated by current events in South Africa and England. whether it was a second Uitlander petition to the Queen, some of President Krieger's speeches outlining reforms, and another provocative speech by Chamberlain, all in March. Krieger's speeches in March and on April 1st about reforms remained remarkably consistent, whether his audience was the loyal burghers of Heidelberg or Uitlander dense Johannesburg. Krieger talked about why Gold's Uitlander drawing power had forced him to raise the residence requirement for attaining the franchise in 1889 from 5 years to the current requirement of 14 years. Krieger said the Transvaal burghers would have been swamped by foreigners if they had kept the original 5-year requirement. Again, a 5-year requirement that even their sister republic, the Orange Free State, had. Krieger did endorse the idea of reducing this residency requirement for the vote from 14 years to 9 years, but assured his Boer audience that this 9-year residency proposal would not jeopardize their independence. Krieger acknowledged that residency requirements in European nations and the United States were lower, only 5 years in the U.S., but the Transvaal faced a very different situation where their migrant population far outnumbered their Boer population. He also said that the Transvaal could gradually move closer to a 5-year residency requirement without injuring itself, and pointed out that Johannesburg, where Uitlanders clustered overwhelmingly, would still only send 2 members to the Volksraad. There would not be proportional representation. Krieger also insisted that any Uitlanders wanting the vote had to renounce their British or other citizenship because he would not allow citizens to serve 2 masters, to have 2 wives in the Transvaal. Even with some of this biblical language, it should be easy to put yourself in Krieger's shoes, at least in a sense. Many world leaders today would balk at signing up to grant the vote to a new voting bloc larger than their nation's current voting population. But it was Krieger who set his nation up for this when he raised the residency requirement from 5 years to 14 years in 1889. Krieger did further complicate the Great Deal negotiations by his die-hard insistence on keeping the dynamite monopoly at all costs, since he saw the monopoly as crucial to Transvaal independence. It didn't help either that a couple of Krieger's negotiators, like William Lades, owned a stake in the dynamite monopoly. This list of complicating factors could go on. Maybe this dynamite monopoly could have been maintained with some major concessions by Krieger, but the mining industry judged Krieger's reforms insufficient. Details meant to be secret from the negotiations were leaked to various British officials in South Africa and Great Britain. Percy Fitzpatrick negotiated as a part of the mining industry's delegation, but privately stated that nothing would come of these negotiations. Fitzpatrick betrayed Smuts and negotiators in the Transvaal delegation by leaking the Transvaal's proposals to various British newspaper outlets in South Africa and Great Britain. This obviously enraged Transvaal officials and put a nail in the coffin of these Great Deal efforts, even making some wonder how much more imminent war was. Chamber of Mines President George A. Rouleau, sorry, I think I butchered that last name, urged Krieger afterward in May to adopt some of the mining industry's reforms that wouldn't risk the independence or dignity of Krieger's country, saying, quote, "These measures would satisfy those that feel strongly on the subject and would silence those that agitate merely for the purpose of agitation." End quote. The former president of the Orange Free State and now State Secretary of the Transvaal, Francis William Rice, cornered Rouleau after his conversation with Krieger and asserted that the capitalists who had tried to stir things up in 1895 were now trying to stir things up between the Transvaal and England. Rouleau challenged Rice, saying, quote, "If your government would act liberally, they would have everyone on their side. But if you want to ignore facts, to ignore public feeling, attribute your own wrongs to other people, and, instead of remedying them, blame others and do nothing, then the situation is hopeless. You will never have peace, and you will be responsible for the consequences." End quote. Things looked increasingly bleak in the Transvaal to everyone wanting to avoid war. Many Uitlanders, the so-called Trojan horse within the Transvaal, hoped to get more intervention from the British after their transmission of their second Uitlander petition. Now back to that second Uitlander petition. The South African League kept in touch with the British agent in Pretoria, Pakenham Green, to make sure their efforts were well-timed. The South African League used both paid and volunteer canvassers to gain 21,000 signatures from British Uitlanders, about 5 times as many signatures as the first petition, and agreed to keep their agitation within constitutional means. The petition claimed that they had sought reform from the Transvaal government, but that the Transvaal had failed to address their grievances. Grievances also mentioned in the first petition: police brutality, the Transvaal Industrial Commission's recommendations set aside, the Transvaal High Court attacked, etc. The second petition claimed that as British subjects, the British signatories deserved the British government's protection and intervention. Green and Percy Fitzpatrick worked to ensure that the second Uitlander petition reached the British government's attention at the same time as news of the failure of Great Deal negotiations. Alfred Milner forwarded these signatures on to the British government on March 28, 1899. With the delivery of the second Uitlander petition, the British government finally saw a reason, or at least sufficient excuse, to intervene in the Transvaal affairs even further. Milner urged Chamberlain to make sure that the British government ceased being patient any longer, and instead pressure the Transvaal to extend the vote immediately. Milner and Green turned up their controlled flow of information from South Africa to stir Chamberlain and company into action. While British cabinet analyzed the situation and tried to decide what to do, Milner wrote an infamous Hellet dispatch that played up Uitlander grievances, failures of the Transvaal government, and the need for British intervention as soon as possible. This Hellet dispatch circulated within the British cabinet. Milner later publicly released this inflammatory Hellet dispatch on June 2nd, but before the public release, the dispatch made 2 senior cabinet members uncomfortable: Hicks Beach and Balfour. They couldn't see the logic, the complaints of the Hellet dispatch being used against any other foreign government as justification for British intervention. So Chamberlain provided a more moderately worded draft dispatch that shifted emphasis from Uitlander financial grievances towards unequal treatment suffered by Uitlanders. This time, the British cabinet gave unanimous support to the dispatch. They embraced the idea of a conference between Milner and Creer that they hoped would lead to a peaceful settlement. Spoiler alert, no peaceful settlement was reached.